Hey, how you doing? This is, stuff you're not supposed to know. How you doing out there, fellow feudal serfs, landless peasants, thinking you own something? How are you? Are you tired of serving your oppressive masters yet? You should be. Your ancestors asked for a king, and so they rejected the Lord. And so God gave them what they wanted, a human king that would take everything away from them, even the ability to realize that everything has been taken away from them. Actually, by the time that happened, it wasn't the king that did that. Even he wasn't as sneaky enough to do that. It was the Pope and the bankers, actually. Not that most of you folks would know, because most people have a tendency to avoid learning about stuff they're not supposed to know. They're obedient peasants, obedient servants. Servants to men, not the Lord. At any rate, this is part 4 of just how in America we wound up being landless peasants, feudal servants. How did that happen? Well, this is part 4 of telling you how it happened. This is your email questions answered by James Montgomery. Here goes. Hello, Robert. The quote from the Legions of Satan book was taken from a book I had read a few years back. It is my understanding this book has long been out of print. I don't understand why you suggest this is a major quote in my research paper. It is not. In fact, if you take it out, it changes nothing. The historical documents speak for themselves. If you look, you will find them. I found most of them on the internet. My work is not a global world order type theory. I would not waste several years researching a subject to prove what most people believe is a fiction. Below I will review just a few of the irrefutable facts. The facts speak for themselves. Fact. A 1213 charter contract took place, wherein the King of England, King John at the time, gave his possessions to the Pope. Fact. The 1215 Magna Carta took place. The King granted rights and lands to the barons, with the Pope signing off on the Magna Carta. Fact. A couple months later, the Pope declared the 1215 Magna Carta null and void. Fact. The King started businesses called Virginia and Carolina, etc. in America. Fact. These American charters were non-revocable trusts. Fact. The King claimed all lands in America settled by his subjects as his, as a matter of conquest. Fact. The King, by way of the charters, possessed allodial ownership of this land. The King did. Fact. By way of the charters, the King retained for himself and all his heirs and successors 30% of all gold, silver, and copper to be sent to him annually. Fact. Our forefathers declared themselves subjects of the King. Fact. The King had lawful title to this land. Our forefathers could not claim what they never owned. Fact. The Revolutionary War was over taxation, not subjection to the King. Fact. The King ceded the land above ground in the 1783 peace treaty to the states. Fact. The King did not cede the gold, silver, and copper to the states. Fact. The King could not cede the minerals to the states because of parties not yet born, his successors yet to serve as future kings of England, as a result of the trust he created. Fact. the inhabitants were not granted anything by the king. Fact, since the king retained the mineral rights to America, no man, free or otherwise, had allodial title to his land. He was a mere tenant. Fact, the king allowed the inhabitants of the states to believe they were free, just as with the British people in the 1215 Magna Carta and the duped Brits in the 1689 Declaration of Rights. Fact, for a short period of time, 11 years to be exact, the inhabitants of the colonies/states were declared to be freemen. Fact, freemen status ended with the passage of the 1787 Constitution, because all state inhabitants were now declared by their representatives to be citizens, subject to the laws of the U.S. government. Fact, the states ceded their grants of land and most of their sovereignty to the 1787 Constitution and government. Fact, the king knew a central government was going to be created by the states when he signed the 1783 Peace Treaty. Fact, by the creation of the 1787 Constitution, a republic was created. Fact, the republic in no way was a hindrance to the king in regaining his land via taxation and banking. Fact, the 1787 Constitution created a 10-mile square district not subject to the restraints of the 1787 Constitution. Fact, the 1789 Judiciary Act, passed by Congress, established courts of law compatible with England, so contracts and business would continue with England. Fact, in 1791, Washington, who once said no to being the king, and also said he did not want independence from the king, nevertheless allowed the office of president to become a monarchy outside of the 1787 Constitution, when he declared he was dividing the states into district states. Fact, the district states are subject to the president. This has never been changed. Fact, 1791. The Bank of the United States was allowed to be chartered by Washington. Fact, the bank was financed by the British Board of Trade, which was controlled by the Pope and the Rothschild cabal. Fact, in 1811, when Congress refused to recharter the bank, England declared war on the United States. Fact, in 1810, the original 13th Amendment was proposed, the one that got memory hold. The original 13th Amendment in 1810, which would have effectively removed the king's power of reclaiming his land from the American people by removing the possibility of lawyers/esquires running and obtaining office in the United States government. Fact, the War of 1812 took place, the main objective of which was the burning of our documents in Washington, which they did. And why did they leave after that? Gee, you capture the enemy's capital, you burn down the main building, and then you leave? Since when does a conquering army take over a capital and then leave? It was obviously they had an objective, they accomplished the objective, they burned the paperwork, and then they left. They had no interest in a conquest. They already had us in conquest financially. Back to the words of Montgomery here. The War of 1812 took place, the main objective of which was the burning of our documents in Washington and the increasing of the debt of the U.S., so the bank would have to be rechartered. That's what the 1812 War was really all about. It was about the original 13th Amendment that would have prevented lawyers/esquires from serving in Congress, because that is a title of nobility. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Do not deny it. The facts are here. Read the rest of what this man, James Montgomery, has written, his research over many, many assiduous years, and read the works of the Informer. The Esquire is a title of nobility. All attorneys in the United States are beholden ultimately to the British barrister. It's a fact. It's a very, very little-known fact, unless you know a few secret handshakes and winks of the eye, but it's a fact. And the other reason for the War of 1812 was because Congress had just had the temerity, the gall, to not re-ante, to not sign up once again to renew the charter of the dastardly National Bank that was even then beholden to the Bank of England, Bank of London. Continuing with Montgomery. Fact. The Jay Treaty of 1792 took place, giving away much of what was won in the 1783 peace treaty. What little was. Fact. In 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered. That's 1816. Fact. In 1836, President Jackson refused to allow the bank to be rechartered. An assassination attempt was then made on his life, of course. Just like what happened with Jesus and JFK. And you can go on down the line. You don't mess with the bankers if you're a leader of any kind. Fact. Since the king was denied the taxation through his bank, Congress then passed the Act of 1845. His emissaries and loyal subjects, the judiciary, i.e. the lawyers/esquires, confirmed the Act of 1845 with the insular cases. I want to know more about those insular cases. What the heck were they? If anybody out there knows, drop me a line, huh? Montgomery writes about them several times, but so far in my reading of his, he never does elaborate on what were these insular cases, which, he claims, allowed admiralty law to come onto land, granting Congress and the President even more power. Fact. England began using propaganda through the news media concerning the slaves in the South when the king was the biggest slave trader in the world. Fact. The Civil War, and I will put in so-called Civil War. I don't know how you can call it a civil war when, civil wars, isn't it? Both sides are vying for total control, for control of the whole nation. Isn't that a proper civil war? No, I think it's more properly, the South just wanted to get the heck away, right? Leave us alone. It's more properly, I think, called the war between the states. Yeah. And it's you're going too far if you're a Southern belligerent to call it, the War of Northern Aggression. And, what is it? What do the Northerners call it? Guys like the Collins brothers, they call this, boy, they call it this because they're up in Ohio. What do they call it? And they don't have their stuff together. They call it, the War of Southern Rebellion. Something like that. It's ridiculous. Folks, let's stay neutral here. It's the war between the states. And it's not the euphemism, the Civil War. It wasn't a civil war. In fact, this so-called Civil War ended the 1787 Constitution, first by sine die, i.e. no lawful Congress. Second, by passage of the 14th Amendment. Fact, the Southern states were granted a full pardon by President Lincoln and Johnson. Fact, the Southern states retook their seats in Congress. Fact. The reseated Southern states voted on the 13th Amendment in Congress, and it was ratified by the Southern states. Fact. The Northern states then redeclared war against the Southern states because they would not then ratify the 14th Amendment. Fact. A permanent state of emergency was declared, and martial law put in place by the unlawful passage of the euphemistically named Reconstruction Acts. Fact. Lawful state governments were removed by an unlawful military occupation by direction of an unlawful Congress. Fact. Puppet governments were put in place by the unlawful military occupying commanders by direction of the unlawful Congress. Fact. The puppet governments of the Southern states ratified the 14th Amendment. Fact. The 1787 Constitution, by the unlawful passage of the 14th Amendment, was forever dead. Fact. With the king again in control, the bankers began the full-fledged rape of America. And that's what I am right now. How about you? I'm raped. How are you? How are you doing? Not raped yet? It's coming. It's coming for you. Fact. In 1869, 1 year after the passage, feudal serf, it's coming for you. 1 year after the passage of the 14th Amendment, Gould and Fisk corner the gold market for the bankers. 1869 that happened, with the help of President Grant, and this was known as Black Friday. Fact. In 1873, Congress removes the silver coin from the market. That same year, the crash of 1873 begins and lasts for 3 years. Fact. In 1900, Congress passes the Gold Standard Act and creates a gold reserve of $150 billion and allows the bankers to sell bonds to maintain this gold level. Fact. In 1907, just 7 years later, the stock market crashes. Fact. Because of this crash, 2 death blows occur in 1913. A. The 16th Amendment is, quote-unquote, passed, and the Federal Reserve Act is passed. Fact. The Federal Reserve Act was written in England at the Bank of England. I'm the one I'm putting quotes in past here for the 16th Amendment. I'm going to go ahead and put the quotes in under the Federal Reserve Act as well, since they waited until, Christmas Eve, when most decent pagan Americans were home, worshiping the Christmas tree, to pass it, and only the bankers' boys were there to vote on it. Anyway, fact, the Federal Reserve Act was written in England at the Bank of England by New York and English bankers. Fact, the Federal Reserve is a direct descendant of England's exchequer, which comes from, you guessed it, William the Conqueror, and his form of taxation via the Doomsday Book. Finally, they're not using euphemisms, these bureaucratic-minded Satan servers. The Doomsday Book. Hey, man, probably because it was back in the Middle Ages, people still talked plain and didn't use Orwellian euphemisms. They called it what it was, the Doomsday Book. Fact, the Doomsday Book of William the Conqueror is the county recorder's office today. Fact, World War I increases the national debt and sees the passage of the War Powers Act in 1917. Fact, the true United States independent treasury, created in 1814, that dealt in specie, was abolished by the Act of 1920, thereby allowing the private Federal Reserve Board to control the money of America as the fiscal agent of the United States. Fact, between 1913 and 1929, the bankers and the Congress enter into gold-guaranteed contracts totaling $300 billion, when only 3% of that amount of gold existed in the world. Fact, the New York bankers, vis-a-vis fraudulent acts, transfer huge amounts of gold to the Bank of England by 1929, along with the debt of the U.S., bringing about the stock market crash of 1929. Fact, in 1933, the American people are declared enemies of the bankers, and the conquest and transference of America is complete. That was 1933, folks. Fact, in 1933, because of the United States corporation's insolvency, the United States is forced to reorganize and implement the social and financial programs mandated by the bankers of New York and England. Fact, in 1933, the king's hold and ownership of America's gold vis-a-vis the bankers is complete, and America's death is ensured by the acceptance of fiat money, Federal Reserve notes. Fact, after 1933, the king's collection of taxes increases along with increased power given to the IRS, his collection arm. You know, kind of like the Sheriff of Nottingham in Middle Age England, Renaissance England, whatever. Fact, World War II increases the debt even further, which demands more taxes on the backs of Americans now that they are co-sureties for the debt as defined by the Federal Insurance Contribution Act of 1934. Fact, now that the enslavement of America is complete, the enslavement of the world was begun by the ratification of the UN Charter in 1945. Fact, the United States had to turn over $8 billion in gold to join the UN just 12 years after there was not enough gold in this country, and it was declared having gold was a crime. That's a good point. You ever thought of that? The U.S. had to turn over $8 billion in gold just to join the UN, and that was only 12 years after it was declared by FDR. There was not enough gold in this country, and your poor everyday average Joe had to go turn in his wedding rings and whatnot. Oh, man. Never underestimate a serf's capability to comply, to be fooled. Here we are. Oh, one more fact. Fact, the Korean and Vietnam Wars explode the debt that is already heaped on the backs of the American people. And so here we are. That's what I said at the beginning, right? Here we are in total feudal serfdom. Welcome, revel in it, right? Revel in it. Go outside and roll around. Go roll around and make dirt angels. Lie on your back and make dirt angels in the king's sand. I mean the Pope's dirt out in your yard. Well, go do that. Revel in it. Enjoy the Pope's dirt, because it sure ain't your dirt. It sure ain't. How do I know? Stop paying your property taxes. See what happens. That goes back to William the Conqueror. Here we are. I have given you just some of the historical facts contained in my research papers, because they are a matter of history, and or congressional record, these cannot be rebutted. I have done the legwork and given the sources in my research papers. Those that are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it. Signed, James Montgomery. The following are some additional facts contributed by the informer that were not contained in James Montgomery's research papers. Fact: the bank was financed by the British Board of Trade that was controlled by the Pope and the Rothschild cabal. Fact: the true independent U.S. Treasury, created in 1846 that dealt in specie, was abolished by the Act of 1920, thereby allowing the private Federal Reserve Board to control the money of America as the fiscal agent of the U.S. Fact: the United States had to turn over $8 billion in gold just to join the UN after... I already read this. All right, so I guess 3 of those facts were contributed by the informer. Moving on to the next email response from James Montgomery. Hello, Stephen. With all due respect to your son, he is wrong. In the North Carolina 1776 Declaration of Rights, we were declared free men. When the 1776 North Carolina Constitution was voted in, they then became members of the state. When the state incorporated into the, now we're getting into caps, state of North Carolina, a subcorporation of the United States, capital U, capital S, any member of the small or lowercase s state became a resident in the capital S state, subject to the laws of the U.S. corporation and the subcorporation, the state of North Carolina. No status, contract, or grant of land could be allowed to violate the private agreement reached in the 1783 peace treaty, where the king gave his blessing on the planned 1787 Constitution and the corporation it created. And this was also the case in Section 25 of the 1776 Declaration of Rights, unbeknownst to the people of North Carolina. The purpose of Section 25 of the 1776 Declaration of Rights was exactly the same as in the 3rd section of the 1689 Declaration of Rights. Aha! Overruling any status, contract, or grant of land that may conflict with earlier charters. Quote, this is from the Declaration of Rights, 1776, North Carolina Constitution, quote, and provided further that nothing herein contained shall affect the titles or possessions of individuals holding or claiming under the laws heretofore in force or grants heretofore made by the late King George II or his predecessors, or the late Lords Proprietors, or any of them, unquote. That does sound a lot like, well, let's read it. Here it comes, the 1689 Declaration of Rights excerpt. Here goes. Quote, provided that no charter or grant or pardon granted before the 23 day of October in the year of our Lord 1689 shall be anyways impeached or invalidated by this act, but that the same shall be and remain of the same force and effect in law, and no other than as if this act had been never made. Unquote. Again, that from the 1689 Declaration of Rights. Yeah, that was uncannily similar to that North Carolina 1776 little fine print. The following is from a court case, Hamilton versus Eaton, 1 North Carolina 641, 1796. Quote, by an act of the legislature of North Carolina, passed in April 1777, it was, among other things, enacted that all persons, being subjects of this state, and now living therein, or who shall hereafter come to live therein, who have traded immediately to Great Britain or Ireland, within 10 years past, in their own right, or acted as factors, storekeepers, or agents here, or in any of the United States of America, for merchants residing in Great Britain or Ireland, shall take an oath of abjuration or allegiance, or depart out of the state, unquote. The following is from a court case, State versus Knight, 1 North Carolina 143, 1799, 2 SA 70. Quote, "The states are to be considered with respect to each other as independent sovereignties, possessing powers completely adequate to their own government, in the exercise of which they are limited only by the nature and objects of government, by their respective constitutions, and by that of the United States. Crimes and misdemeanors committed within the limits of each are punishable only by the jurisdiction of that state where they arise. For the right of punishing, being founded upon the consent of the citizens, express or implied, cannot be directed against those who never were citizens, and who likewise committed the offense beyond the territorial limits of the state claiming jurisdiction. Our legislature may define and punish crimes committed within the state, whether by citizens or strangers, because the former are supposed to have consented to all laws made by the legislature, and the latter, whether their residence be temporary or permanent, do impliedly agree to yield obedience to all such laws as long as they remain in the state," unquote. Once again, there goes George Gordon's argument right out the window. Again, that was from State versus Knight, 1 North Carolina 143, 2 SA 70 from 1799. Back to the words of Montgomery. In State versus Knight, from 1799, "Your presence in the state makes you subject to its laws. Below, you will see that those in the state are subject to the laws of the United States, and by voting you are automatically a citizen of the U.S. A citizen of the U.S. is not a free man, because of the obligations a citizen incurs. As a resident, you are subject to the laws of the U.S. and the corporate state, capital S, in which you live, period. Look up citizen and subject in Black's Law Dictionary. All of this is before the 1787 Constitution was made null and void during the so-called Civil War. Article 6, Suffrage. What is this from? What is this from? It doesn't say what this is from. Article 6, Suffrage and Eligibility to Office. Is this from the... this is the 1787 Constitution. Okay, Article 6, Suffrage and Eligibility to Office. Section 1. Every male person born in the... I don't want to read all this. It just lists Section 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from Article 6 of the 1787 Constitution. James Montgomery closes up... Oh no, he's got one more paragraph after this. Back to the words of Montgomery. Your son is wrong about the United States government not being a centralized government. read the Federalist Papers, or read Patrick Henry's speeches, etc., etc. There are many documents that settle this. The United States was a monarchy right out of the gate. The Congress was the House of Lords. The "we the people" was our forefathers. They were talking about themselves, those that created the corporation. They were not talking about the common people, who never got to see or vote on the contents of the U.S. Constitution. From the very beginning, the federal government ruled over and taxed the common people. Your son says it was not a centralized government. He is dead wrong. He is basing his statements on what he was taught in public school. Ask him, did they teach him about Washington being given monarchical powers beyond and outside the Constitution? Ask him, was he ever taught that Washington divided the states into district states in 1791? Ask him, was he taught about Congress granting Washington power not granted to the President in the Constitution? Ask him, was he taught about Washington being given emergency war powers long before the so-called Civil War to do what Congress had already been granted to do under the Constitution? This gave Washington the power to operate outside of the restraints of the Constitution, such as allowing the Bank of the United States to receive their charter. I would continue, but I feel the best thing to do is to tell him to read the attached email and my America is Still a British Colony, Parts 1, 2, and 3. Or I think that's the United States is still a British colony. Also, read The New History of America by The Informer. He needs to also read Which One Are You by The Informer, since his knowledge is so far behind regarding historical and legal fact. I am sending this to The Informer for him to add his comments. Your son needs to be made aware of his misunderstanding of history and law. Signed, James. Next email. Hey, Fred, I hope it goes without saying I was and am in agreement with what you said before and below in this post. The reality of the core problem is so very hidden and deceptive, but at the same time painfully obvious. Below, you said, screw the treaties and martial law because we are not parties to them. I agree, but this is where the Informer and I have a hard time getting people to understand the seriousness of our condition. You have to imagine there are no troops in the streets, locked and loaded, ready to fire on anyone attempting to challenge the military occupation. In that condition, it makes no difference if you are a party or not. Military occupation is by force. Martial law is by force of arms. That is our condition, even though you do not see troops in the streets. We are nevertheless under a military occupying force. The Commander-in-Chief controls the military and the laws governing the occupied territory. To make sure you understand the seriousness of this, it would be no different if you lived in Poland or France controlled by Nazi Germany. The Germans dictated to the occupied countries the laws they would follow, the public policy/rules of necessity. The occupied countries' laws/constitutions still existed. However, where they came into conflict with the public policy of Germany, they were set aside, made null and void. If you did not obey or challenged the public policy of Germany, you were paid a visit from the SS or the local police which existed to enforce the public policy and dictates of Germany and its commander-in-chief. If you still refused to march to the party line, it meant imprisonment or death. There is absolutely no difference in this scenario and what we have today. Someone would say, but this is a free country, he writes. I would agree this is a free country up to the point of challenging the military occupying force. As I said before, the Constitution does exist up to the point of coming in conflict with the public policy of the Commander-in-Chief. What is that public policy? Enforcement of the trust for the parties of interest / contracting parties and collecting the debt to pay for the occupying force and the parties of interest. When you read quotes from the following document, remember only the contracting parties in a war. Only the contracting parties in a war dictate terms of occupation or surrender. I am taking only a few quotes because of the size of the document. Also, remember this document came from Lincoln's having codified the War Powers Lieber Code. Convention 4. Respecting the laws and customs of war on land. Signed at The Hague, 18 October 1907. Who, after having deposited their full powers, found in good and due form, have agreed upon the following. Article 1. The contracting powers shall issue instructions to their armed land forces, which shall be in conformity with the regulations respecting the laws and customs of war on land annexed to the present convention. Article 2. The provisions contained in the regulations referred to in Article 1, as well as in the present convention, do not apply except between contracting powers, and then only if all the belligerents are parties to the convention. Article 3. A belligerent party which violates the provisions of the said regulations shall, if the case demands, be liable to pay compensation. It shall be responsible for all acts committed by persons forming part of its armed forces. Chapter 2. Prisoners of War. Here is the meat. Article 8. Prisoners of war shall be subject to the laws, regulations, and orders in force in the army of the state in whose power they are. Any act of insubordination justifies the adoption towards them of such measures of severity as may be considered necessary. Article 10. Prisoners of war may be set at liberty on parole if the laws of their country allow, and in such cases they are bound, on their personal honor, scrupulously to fulfill, both towards their own government and the government by whom they were made prisoners, the engagements they have contracted. We are POWs. All right, he goes on, chapter 1, chapter 5. This is a whole page of legalese here. Section 3, military authority over the territory of the hostile state. This took place after the Reconstruction Acts, and it has never ended, writes James Montgomery. Means of injuring the enemy. That's us. Next page, we'll skip that. Here's one. Article 45. It is forbidden to compel the inhabitants of occupied territory to swear allegiance to the hostile power. And then James Montgomery couldn't help but put in his own note following that one. He writes, "This is one violation the de facto Congress committed in the Reconstruction Acts, forcing the allegiance of the inhabitants of the southern states by way of declaring residence through registering to vote. This declaration by voting has never changed, albeit more vague." He writes, albeit. All right. Albeit more vague. "You have to declare you are a citizen of the United States and the state in which you reside." All right, a bunch more legalese. Oh, boy. And then finally it gets back to the words of James Montgomery as he closes out this email. "You asked what we can do. Only a few aberrations exist in Congress, and if they get too far out of line with the public policy, they end up like Congressman Dornan or Congressman Bono. The best we can do at this time is educate. Read The Art of War. The Chinese are masters of fighting unwinnable wars. But even their art of war would not work in our situation, because guerrilla warfare only works if the inhabitants of the country are on your side. So what is the answer? You mentioned Revelation and Babylon. This is how change will take place. When Babylon is destroyed, the head will be cut off from the body." Come, Jesus, come. "But we must still educate, lest a worse system take Babylon's place." And that concludes that email. Frederick Fox wrote, "Dear James, thanks for infoing all the people you did regarding my email to you. You are correct. If we are under war and emergency powers / rules of necessity / public policy regarding the Eric Doctrine / martial law, what kind of leg do we stand on? The fact is, most of the people of this great nation do not have a clue as to what is going on, or what has gone on. Therefore, it is again up to a handful of informed Americans to spread the word. The word is given. Spread it." Which word is he talking about? He capitalizes word here once, and the other time he doesn't. If he's talking about fixing the United States, the America, forget it. That's going to take Jesus Christ coming down and doing a number on it himself, on Babylon. And watch the reaction when the people realize they have been raped, pillaged, and plundered, and sodomized by the king in the name of whatever kind of contract / trust / treaty, etc. we are subject to. I kind of feel that as intelligent as some folks are, they will get their collectives' heads out of the sand and see the big picture. Oh boy, I'm not feeling that. I kind of feel this is not Montgomery writing, it's one of his readers. I kind of feel this is a test to see just what we Americans are made of. Man, this guy's optimistic. I'll tell you what they're made of. They're made of aluminum and fluoride and mercury. That's what Americans are made of. There's your answer. After all, we are, quote-unquote, the grand experiment in terms of politics, sociology, and economics. I say screw martial law. Screw treaties we were never parties to. Screw public policies and screw the crown, whomever wears it. That's all fine and nice to say, but what does that do? Most life forms find involuntary servitude appalling and a violation of natural law. Well, most Americans don't. Look around. Where's this guy living? We are a nation of laws and not a nation of men, according to Jefferson. What was Jefferson? A deist who tried to rewrite the Bible. Okay. Let's take our power back and do something about this problem. What? What are you going to do without Jesus Christ? There are solutions. What? Outside of Jesus Christ. What solutions? I wonder why Montgomery included this. We just need to choose the right one. Yeah, Jesus Christ. There's your right one. And it does not happen in this temporal existence. Well, until he comes back to pierce that veil the second time for good. Scripture, Revelation, says that Babylon will fall in 1 hour. It does not infer the world will end in 1 hour. 1 hour is all the time it would take Congress to repeal the 14th Amendment, the 16th Amendment, not going to happen, not going to happen. The Federal Reserve Act, not going to happen. The Trading with the Enemy Act, not going to happen. To reinstitute the original 13th Amendment, not going to happen. And go from there, for starters. That would be real progress, and I believe that it can be done. Well, that's nice. And if you lose a tooth, do you put it under your pillow and wait for the ferry? Knowledge is power, and we are now armed with a potent weapon, Semper Fi, and all that good stuff, Foxy. I'm not seeing that, but it's nice that that he's not. It's nice that he's reading Montgomery, and that he's on the right side. It's his optimism. His optimism is a little more than a little unwarranted, I would say. The following, okay, this is a presidential document from 1992. The President, Infrastructure Privatization. Why did Montgomery enclose this? I do not know. Director of Office Management and Budget. I don't know. Maybe he'll tell what that's about in the next email. But that will occur during the next show because we are out of time here. Okay, folks. You've been listening to Part 4 of Email Questions Answered by James Montgomery. And this has been Stuff You're Not Supposed to Know. And I'm nobody. Over and out, eh?